mute. Okay, so we're gonna get started real quick. I'm Sarah with Colorado Cattlemen's Association. We just want to thank Bear, who was one of our annual convention sponsors, and they wanted to connect with our membership and talk a little bit about a new product that they are launching. So I'm going to send it over to Derek with Bear, and he's going to get things started.
All right, Sarah, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Colorado Cattlemen's Association, for getting us involved with the convention. And like this year, a lot of webinars, a lot of online. So we're just happy to be here to be able to share this new opportunity with you. This is a new tool for rangeland restoration, which is really exciting. It's called Rejuvra, and we're going to walk through, you know, invasive annual grass management, why it's important, why we should care, why even manage for invasive grasses. And then I'll talk about some of the research that's been going on behind the scenes with Rejuvra. I actually began this in 2012, this project. So this has been being evaluated for quite a few years. It actually started here at CSU along the Front Range of Colorado, like you can see in this photo on the right-hand side. It was treated. Myself, I'm Derek Sebastian. I actually had the opportunity to do my master's and PhD at CSU all around Rejuvra and this long-term invasive grass management. And it's been really exciting to see that project propel forward and just, and now we have the full grazing label. We actually just got that a few months ago, and we've just begun to launch Rejuvra. So it's now available. And Justin Hosfeld is our Western Range segment manager. So he covers the Western U.S. and is in charge of our range and pasture group. And it's exciting. He's going to talk about, he has a lot of ranch experience, and he's going to talk about what this means for ranchers and producers having a tool like this now with a grazing label for rangeland restoration here in the Western U.S. And I'm just going to kick off with a little bit of background on invasive grasses and then go into what is Rejuvra, and then I'll hand this over to Justin to finish things up. Okay. It's not letting me advance, Sarah. Oh, there we go. Okay, so invasive annual grasses in the West, they are completely devastating the West, like you guys know. When you get these sites that look like this is in Nevada. So these are areas where fires have ripped through multiple times in an area, completely devastating the landscape, and it really wipes out all your perennial species, whether that be shrubs, your forage grasses, your forbs that are really important for nutrition. And once you get these fires, that cycle just continues. And then you start seeing, like we are right now, you get wildfires all throughout the West, millions of, hundreds of millions of acres that burn up in the West, displacing all of our forage production and grasses that we have on the landscape. And when you look at cheatgrass, and when you drive along, heading east out of Greeley, if you go in the Front Range, the foothills, up even to Rocky Mountain National Park, there's nowhere that cheatgrass is not. And that's the thing is if we do nothing, there's really just going to continue to devastate the West and increase the fire frequency and all these other things. So we now have this tool that I'll talk about today where we can actually try to get ahead of the game when it comes to invasive grasses and the devastation that they are having on the West. When you look at invasive grasses, this is some work coming out of BLM, and they're showing that basically if there's any cheatgrass in the site, it's 4 times more frequently that those areas will burn. And if this, just like this last weekend, there was ash literally falling from the sky. I live over in Greeley, and there's ash all over the place from these huge wildfires. And a lot of the reason behind these fires is the fine fuels like cheatgrass, where they're able to carry a fire much more quickly. And it's a linkage between your perennial plant community. So it makes that continuous fine fuel layer that the fire can really sweep through an area, like you see on the right-hand side, where you have this shrub that's just engulfed in cheatgrass. And once that fire ignites, it's able to carry across the landscape, and it can completely devastate areas. And when you look at invasive winter annual grasses, it's not just one species, right? We have cheatgrass, Japanese brome. Those are the most common ones that we see here. And I see probably a 50-50 mix of Japanese brome and cheatgrass. But we also have now ventonata and medusa head. And actually, these two haven't been identified in Colorado yet, but they're knocking on our door. They've been found in Utah, Wyoming, Montana, and all throughout the Pacific Northwest. And what's really scary about these two invasive grasses is they have absolutely no forage value because they have such high silica content that cattle will actually completely avoid areas with these invasive grasses. Where cheatgrass you can graze for 1 to 2 weeks in the spring or early fall, but Medusa head and ventonata cattle just completely avoid this. And we've actually found that these two species will outcompete and even take over cheatgrass infested areas. And so as we see these new invaders, including cheatgrass, continue to get worse, it's really important that we get ahead of the game and really protect areas that we still can before these fires continue to rip through these sites. Some other ones we have, bulbous bluegrass. It's a pretty common one that I'm hearing a lot about, getting a lot of calls. It actually has little bulblets instead of seeds, which is really interesting. And actually the tool that we'll talk about today does control the little bulblets that you get from bulbous bluegrass. And then there's a few other species as well, jointed goatgrass, rattlesnake brome, and there's the list goes on. But these winter annual grasses are so devastating because they germinate this time of year. So all this rainfall, this snow that we're getting right now is going to spark that germination, and it's going to grow throughout the whole winter and use up all the moisture and nutrients from our, production grasses that we need in the spring before they even come out of dormancy. They're just being exploited. And so that's really why we need to manage these. And when you look at invasive grasses, they're truly top of mind right now because there's this huge link between cheatgrass and wildfire and the devastation that it's having on wildlife, such as sage grouse, mule deer habitat. I'll talk a little bit more about coming up, but it's just, it's top of mind, especially when it comes to invasive grasses and wildfires and what this means to, landscape scale impacts that they can have. And what's really important is that a lot of our front range and out to the east of Colorado, we still have these desirable remnant populations of forage grasses, forbs, shrubs, and it only takes 1 to 2 wildfires to rip through there until you have these complete monocultures, right? Like I've driven through, Wiggins area, and you have complete areas where there's no understory of natives. But in a lot of cases, we still have these natives that we can restore. And it can be as simple as 1 to 2 treatments where we can get that native plant community back and deplete the seed bank of cheatgrass. And that's really the goal, is save what we have, because like you all know, reseeding, revegetation after fire is such a huge issue. So how can we restore these areas? Prioritize sites that have your remnant plant communities and those forage grasses that you really need. This is a really key figure that I presented on, and this is some of the work we did at CSU, and this is very important to talk about. Whether it's cheatgrass or it's thistles or it's Dalmatian toadflax, whatever the weed species that you're trying to control, really the seed bank is really the target. Because if you just control that plant the first year and it comes back via the seed bank, which is what occurs a lot of the time, you're not gaining ground on these species. So what we did was looked at how long do we need to manage cheatgrass to actually deplete the seed bank and get ahead of the game with this weed, because we've done prescribed burning, we've had plateau as a treatment, we've been able to use a masopic plateau, matrix, rimsulfuron, you could just use glyphosate. But the problem with those products or those tools is they're only 1, maybe 2 years control at the most. And if you look at this depiction, if you did 2 years of management, you still have a lot of seed left in the seed bank. Even 3 years of management, you still have a lot of seeds left in the seed bank. But what we found is that if you can manage for 4 years or 5 years and get that level of control, that's really when you can start to gain ground on cheatgrass. And that's when your natives start to come back, they rebound, that fine fuel is eliminated, so that fire hazard, and really that's when we can start to gain ground. So just something to think about is seed bank is so important when we're talking about cheatgrass, and maybe why in the past we haven't had the success that we really need is due to that. And the Rejuvra that I'll talk about and introduce you to is giving us 3-4 years control with 1 treatment. And so this really allows us to get ahead of the game when it comes to cheatgrass and invasive grasses in general. And like I've said, treatment success is dependent on eliminating the seed bank, because if you just have that short term, the 1-2 years, you can see how many seeds are still viable, and you're really not going to gain ground on species like cheatgrass. So what is Rejuvra and how does it work? I'm going to talk a little bit about this new tool. So Rejuvra is something that we've been working on since 2012. That's when we put out our first research trials in actually Rifle, Colorado. And what we did is we put these out on these rangeland settings, and we went back the second year and we were like, wow, the control looks great. You go back the third year and it was still holding control at a high level. And this was something that we haven't had in the past, where you can go out with 1 treatment and get 2, 3, 4 years control with 1 treatment. And that's really what this tool is providing us. And what we've been using in the past has been called Esplanade 200 SC. So you may be familiar with that. This is the same formulation as Esplanade 200 SC, except for now this will have the full grazing label. It has a 0-day grazing restriction, and it can be used on several different sites, which I'll talk about here in a second. When you look at all the work that goes into these tools, it's kind of amazing because, you think about, maybe a research trial here and there, but really overall what we've done is about 130 replicated trials throughout the West. Because when we first started this at CSU, it was like, we're seeing really good control at this site and that site and in the greenhouse. But like we know, when you get operational, when you get out on the environment where you have different soils and moistures and all these different, these different parameters, are we going to see the same level of control in Oregon, Montana, as we are in Colorado? And the amazing thing is we are. This is probably the most consistent tool I've seen on invasive grasses overall that's been out there. And it's really exciting because we worked with 18 universities, a lot of graduate students, and a lot of counties, municipalities, land managers, ranchers. There's been a huge effort in terms of getting and collecting data to show that this tool is consistent and it does provide the level of control that we need to really gain ground on cheatgrass. And when you look at the use sites for this product, it's going to be rangeland full use, right? And this is what we've been waiting for about 6 years. So we needed to first test that it works well on these species. We don't get non-target impacts. We're not going to be, injuring our native perennial grasses, forbs, and shrubs, and that there's no toxicology issues in terms of water quality, bee issues, cattle grazing issues. So this new rangeland label opens us up to any site that's grazed by livestock with a 0-day grazing restriction. And we can also use this on non-graze sites like natural areas such as parks and open space, wildlife areas, if you're doing fire rehab areas, prairies, fire breaks. So these are also use sites that you could use with Rejuvra. And you might be saying, so how do we get long-term control 3-4 years without injuring our native plants? And just like this photo shows on the right, how can we selectively take out cheatgrass and not injure our native perennial plants? And what's really cool about this tool is that it's based on where the herbicide is in the soil. If you look at this depiction on the bottom left-hand corner, the herbicide stays in the top 1 to 2 centimeters of soil, and it binds very heavily to organic matter, soil particles. And what we see is that our perennial plants, it's a root inhibitor. So our perennial plants have roots that are well below that herbicide zone. Whereas cheatgrass germinates in that top soil profile. So we're able to selectively take out cheatgrass and other invasive annual grasses and certain broadleaf species that come back via seed and not impact our perennials. So when we take out cheatgrass, and Justin will talk about this, it's honestly like fertilizing your rangeland because we're seeing, 2 to 10-fold increase in production by just taking out cheatgrass from a system. And that just shows you how much this invasive grass can devastate an area. It's different than, thistle, like let's say Canada thistle, where it's kind of patchy. Cheatgrass usually infests over an entire pasture rangeland situation, and it exploits that whole system. Where if you're able to take out cheatgrass, it opens up a lot of things for your operation, which Justin's going to touch on in his presentation. And then when you talk about native species tolerance, you can see that the different labeled rates of Rejuvra, 3, 5, and 7 ounces. 5 ounces is the highest labeled rate for grazing sites. We don't see issues on perennial plants. So you can see this needle and thread on the top, the scarlet globe mallow on the bottom, and then this example of an operational treatment on the right. We can selectively take out cheatgrass and leave our desirable perennial grasses, forbs, shrubs, which is unlike any other tool that we've had in our toolbox in the past. Okay, so what types of combination treatments or what does timing look like for this product? Like I said, Rejuvra inhibits roots of new germinating seedlings. So what you need to do is get it out early before germination if you're going to use just Rejuvra. So that would be that green example on the left. So June through August, you can use straight Rejuvra. If you're in this time, like early, August, September, October, when we can get germination, especially with some of this moisture that we're getting today, you can get that below ground root growth, and then you just start to see it poking through. That's when we need to add Plateau to Rejuvra, because Plateau can give us that control of those little seedling, those little seedling cheatgrass that have emerged, and Rejuvra is going to give us that 2, 3, 4 years of extended residual control. And then when you get in the later part of the winter, when it's dormant, the grasses are dormant, you can add glyphosate. So go with 8 ounces of glyphosate to control those cheatgrass seedlings, and then add Rejuvra to give you that longevity. And again, we're trying to deplete the seed bank of cheatgrass, which we need to get 4 or 5 years of total control to really gain ground, like I said, on cheatgrass. And this is really important. And this was a cool operational work that we did over in Boulder County. This is by Rabbit Mountain Open Space, if you're familiar with that, kind of by Lions. And what we did is these large demo blocks, and the untreated here is in the center, and then we have Rejuvra treatments on both sides, followed by a plateau treatment. And what do we see here? The plateau looks a lot like the untreated. And in the first year, plateau looked really good, but then it came roaring back with the cheatgrass seedlings the second and third year because the water-soluble herbicide was not in the soil any longer, and it just allowed those seedlings to come through. When you look at Rejuvra, you can see to the line what that looks like 3 years out. And I can't tell you how many different areas that we've had this, this same situation occur where you release those native plants because you're able to deplete the cheatgrass seed bank. And again, like fertilizing your range, you're able to now use all that moisture and nutrients on your rangeland. And then when you look at this cheatgrass control from an operator, from a trial, different research studies, this was actually 2 research studies in Colorado and 1 in Utah. And this is 3 years after treatment. Anything with Rejuvra had the light blue bars, and some of the standard older treatments is in the dark blue. And what you see is that by the 3rd year, the only thing that's still giving us longevity or some level of control is anything that had Rejuvra. If we didn't have Rejuvra and we had glyphosate or just plateau or just matrix, it initially looked good, and then by the 2nd, 3rd year, there was little to no control left. And that's really where we're at. You guys have a certain amount of money you want to invest in tools, and if they're not giving us long-term control or longevity, are we really gaining ground on these species, and are we really restoring these areas like we want to? I don't believe so. And this Rejuvra does give us the chance to get to that point, which is really exciting. And like I've said, the other products, the other tools that we've used are just so water soluble that by the 2nd year, as all that moisture and rain comes through, there's no herbicide left in the soil, and it's not able to provide any level of control. And that's why you see it reverting back to the untreated amounts. And then I'm just going to talk about some of the cool kind of side spin projects that we've done with this tool over the past 4 or 5 years. One of the main things that I think you folks are interested in, and Justin's going to touch on, is forage production increase with Rejuvra. In areas that we've treated, we get a 2 to 10-fold increase in production. And like this photo shows, if you can selectively take out cheatgrass, look how good that grass does. Look how good that Western wheatgrass responded. And we've seen this time and time again. When you look at native plants, if you're into pollinators, everybody has, those things that they're important to them on their range. And some of that is pollinators and wildlife habitat restoration. And so we've done a lot of different projects in this realm showing that, and actually documenting that if we can take out cheatgrass, we see more flowers per plant in these areas that we treat, which means more pollinator habitat, more bee diversity, and the whatnot. So you can see on this bottom picture what that treatment looks like and the response of those native perennial plants. And this is really interesting because we've actually done these projects now where we treat mahogany, bitterbrush, and when you take out cheatgrass, you actually get a 2 to 3-fold increase in new leader growth of those shrubs, which means more wildlife habitat for these mule deer. And what they found, and this is actually an article from last year, it actually showed that cheatgrass is the #1 threat to mule deer. It's not carnivores, development, or disease. It's cheatgrass because it's having these wildfire impacts that devastate their range. It gets in their mouth and ears and eyes, and it causes infection. So cheatgrass is a huge, even beyond some of the day-to-day things that we think about. And then strategically on your range, you can create fire breaks, decreasing that wildfire risk, which I think is even more important now than it ever has been with all the wildfires we see. So if you're able to go create these landscape kind of, strategic treatments for fire breaks on your range, it can be really, really beneficial because you can imagine if a wildfire, a chain sparks on that roadside and it carries to that fence line, having a treatment's going to stop that. Whereas if that cheatgrass is there, it's just going to carry through and continue to devastate that land. The other thing that we're looking at that I'm not going to dive a whole lot into is noxious weeds. Actually, the main reason they come back is via seed as well. So if that's common mullein, Dalmatian toadflax, your thistles, a lot of those produce a lot of seeds, thousands, if not millions of seeds. And what we found is if you tank mix Rejuvra with some of these other treatments options for broadleaf weeds, you can actually extend the life of that treatment by 2 or 3 years. So something else to consider when you're targeting noxious weeds as well. And then the big thing is just restoring rangeland. As cheatgrass is continuing to devastate, it's going to continue to degrade these sites. And we really need to protect those perennial native plant communities that are still intact, like you see on the right-hand side. And it's just a great opportunity if you have these types of sites on your range to really target those and get after it while you still can. And then, like I've said, you know, Rejuvra gives us multi-year control of all invasive annual grasses and certain broadleaf species. Past management, it's only given us that short-term control where we've needed that 2, 3, 4 years of control to get at the seed bank of these noxious invasive species. And that's really what this tool provides us, is the opportunity to deplete the seed bank. And then that's when you can see all these different benefits occur, that forage production increase, that wildfire threat decrease, increased wildlife habitat, as well as pollinator habitat. So I appreciate your time, and just this was a brief overview of kind of where we've been with Rejuvra in terms of development, what this tool provides, and now Justin's going to give us some background on what does this mean for the ranchers out there. What does this tool provide? I'll hand this over to Justin.
Thanks, Derek. So get through a few of the technical issues here, get my screen to share. So Derek has done a very good job of explaining how the herbicide works, how it creates this release, how we get more forage now and healthier forage. So what I want to do is I want to roll down through and talk about what does that mean to the livestock operation. We know more grass is good, but where do we get to see it? Whoops, going the wrong direction. So from here, this is a great photo that I really like to put up there, and helps us wrap our mind around what we're dealing with out on the range. So as you can see out here on the left, this is the untreated area with the population of cheatgrass involved. And if we were to wrap our mind around this as being a pasture, you can see that in time we have very little acreage within this pasture to use. So cattle will graze these areas, but soon they're going to tire from the abrasive nature and trying to work through these annual grasses and start to come over here and start to overutilize the non-infested areas, which not only it slows our ability to harvest the most amount of pounds of grass we can, but it also helps the spread of the invasive grasses when we overutilize these. But as you see on the right side, if this were a pasture that's treated, we have much more consistent forage, not only in quantity, but in quality. And you could see that we get much better livestock distribution and much better utilization of all the acres that we have available. Not only do they impede the quality, but as you can see, this is just a picture I took last fall, and this is actually of an area infested with vent nata. And this swings back to Derek's comment about the low palatability and low forage quality of vent nata. You can see that there was cattle work in this area, and they had very few areas with the vent nata present that they came in and used. So that becomes huge when we talk about overall distribution and utilization. And as Derek mentioned earlier, I bring this photo back up because it helps us visualize the mat or the blanket that cheatgrass becomes. And when we take that out, it is akin to fertilizing and irrigating our annual pasture. So one thing I want to talk about is the value of improved forage. A lot of times as we're driving down the road and we're looking out across the pastures and across the range, I don't know that we're necessarily truly realizing what we're looking at. So for optimal efficiency and profitability, livestock operations do best when livestock are out there grazing on their own, somewhat unassisted, and able to spread out and utilize that resource as best they can. When we start to step in and have to help them, not only does that cost us money, but a lot of times when we start to affect their efforts, we also make them less efficient. 81% of the average beef animal's diet consists of grazed and cellulosic forage sources. When you think about that, that's huge from a food supply and a beef production standpoint. When we think about when a steer goes from calfhood to being harvested, that 81% of his diet comes from the kind of area that we're stewards of, that becomes very impactful. Cattle graze over 800 million acres that are inadequate for raising food for human consumption, and 90% of the forage consumed by beef cattle is edible by humans. So again, that gives us a greater appreciation for these acres that are infested with these annual grasses and what they mean to the world. Upcycling and environmental benefits improve dramatically from controlling invasive grasses, things like carbon sequestration, watershed health, all those things improve as those annual grasses are controlled. So as we talk about the benefits of improved forage quality, one thing I want to talk about is the cumulative effect of reduced forage quality. So as we can see here in this photo, this area right here in the kind of the center photo infested with cheatgrass, when we judge these two forage resources, we use the term called TDN, which is total digestible nutrients. And that's how we gauge what kind of nutrition is in that forage resource. Here, this area is probably about a 35 TDN, whereas that greener non-infested area is more of a 55 to almost 60% TDN. Well, as cattle have that lower TDN in their diet, they have to consume more to meet their needs. And so let's say a cow and a calf grazing on this infested area, she'd have to eat an additional 10 pounds of forage per day or 300 pounds of forage per month just to make up for the lower forage quality. And when we think about that across all the animals that are grazing rangeland, not only just cattle, but the others, that becomes a huge amount of forage that is essentially wasted just because of the presence of the cheatgrass. And livestock, they graze by the mouthful instead of with tweezers. So the presence of these unpalatable and abrasive annual grasses make them much more selective, and therefore we don't get the distribution, and they tend to overutilize areas, and which makes us rotate through pastures quicker and get less benefit from that pasture. But when we remove these annual grasses, then there's a lot of new things that become available. And first thing I want to talk about is when these annual grasses are gone, and we talk about this like irrigating your range, these annual grasses keep rangeland in almost a constant state of drought, where they're sitting there right at the surface, using up the lion's share of that moisture as it comes. Then the other plants that we're trying to harvest, they're much lower quality, and they're much lower in whole plant moisture. And so when we can raise that whole plant moisture, not only does that help us in avoiding fire danger, but that also really affects livestock efficiency, because now she can stay out and graze longer with putting less pressure on the water distribution resource and the water resources in the whole ecosystem. And so let's say if this here that on the left is the infested side, that with the whole plant moisture is running about 35 to 33% during all the areas that we've sampled. Whereas here where the annual grasses are removed, the whole plant moisture in this area is more in the 50s, could be close to 60% moisture. To a cow that's grazing all day long, that could equal up to 4 gallons of water a day she's picking up by harvesting grass that she wouldn't be getting from this side. As Derek mentioned, when we remove these annual grasses, we get 2.5 to 3 times or more usable forage, and that's very beneficial when we come to livestock distribution and their use of the resource. With the increase of the diverse group of other forbs and plants that comes along with it, that gives us the true ration on the range. That's where we want more grass, and that's very key, but we also want more of those other plants that are actually higher in protein and higher in those trace minerals and all the rest of the things that we need for her to get her true balanced diet. And when we start to meet her total TDN, then she puts far less pressure on the ecosystem. As many of you know, if she has a good forage resource, she'll graze until 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, lay down, start to digest that, as opposed to grazing later in the day, harvesting more feed, which makes her less efficient and puts more impact on, or more pressure on the ecosystem. So what we wanted to do is, we knew we were getting this response, but we wanted to know what the cost of treatment, how that affected us on an operating standpoint, and where we started to see the benefits. So when we took the cost of applying Rejuvra and amortized it out across the lifespan of the Rejuvra, we were finding that it only raised our annual expenses by 7%. And as Derek talked about earlier, I won't get into necessarily the pounds of forage response, but what I do want to talk about is prior to treatment, in this one study that we did, we found that it was taking 2.6 acres to run a cow-calf per month. And once we removed those annual grasses, it was taking just a little under 1 acre to run her for a month, which again, that's significant when we're trying to run year round and trying to do the best, be the best stewards to the resource. And I'll get to this on the next slide, but we saw a significant reduction in expenses by these new opportunities, and a significant increase in revenue from the new forage resource that we'd have available to us. And with this new opportunity, we were seeing ability, because of the more pounds of beef and the less expensive, we were able to recoup the initial investment in 2 to 3 years' time. So here's where we boiled it down a little more. We looked at it, where were our costs going and where were we going to see the impact from the treatment? So our summer grazing and handling costs, they stayed about the same, and that's running fence, putting out salt and mineral, taking care of water, doing all the rest of those things, that stayed about the same. Salt, mineral, and vet costs, that's how much it was costing us in this one study per pair. One could say that your supplementation costs could go down because you have a higher quality forage, but there are still just some trace minerals and some things that still need to be there, so we left that the same. But once we started to move into commodity costs and feeding her for the winter, that's where we really saw an advantage. And we saw in this particular study that it wasn't always just feed getting snowed under that forced us to come in and start to augment her forage resources. A lot of times it was because we were rotating through pastures much quicker than we wanted to do, because we started to overutilize the non-infested areas, that we would come in and start feeding before we needed to. So now with those annual grasses gone, our forage resources were lasting much longer. We're rotating through pastures slower. We could graze later into the season. And even if it did snow under, we had that grass in the bank. So next spring, we all know how a cow calf is. Once she has a calf at her side, she wants to quit you. She wants off the feed ground. She wants to get out. So not only were we getting later grazing season in the fall, but we had some better pasture to turn out on in the spring, and we were moving our grazing season earlier into the spring as well. So we were seeing significant saving in feed costs and in the infrastructure that it took to get that feed to her and to support her needs. So the rest of it, depreciation and the other things that we have, we knew were fixed. But at the end of the day, we were seeing almost $100 advantage from these new opportunities. And we know in the livestock business, anytime you can find $100, that's very significant. So the next thing we wanted to think about, and as we all know in the ranching industry, this is a very low margin business, and our capital improvement dollars, they're minimal, and there's a lot of pressure pulling on them. So we wanted to look at how did treating the range with Rejuvra and removing the annual grasses and the benefits we get from that, how did that compare to other investments we might make? And so let's say like upgrading our genetics, getting a heavier weaning weight, or if you're a stocker operator, moving in the right kind of genetics to prove yearling performance, that actually is a pretty good investment and runs fairly close to what improving the range would be. But when we started to look at, let's say, additional cross fencing and water improvement, that's a good investment, but it's a long-term investment. It takes a lot longer to get the benefit, and you're still dealing with that degraded rangeland. You're trying to promote grazing distribution and better utilization, but you're still dealing with a poor resource to begin with. And then when we looked at harvest equipment, it's something we have to have, and it provides something essential to the operation. But as we all know, as a short-term investment, it's a pretty tough one because it requires a lot of labor, a lot of parts, a lot of fuel. And so then when we looked at rangeland restoration, we elevated the entire ranch, which actually makes all the rest of these tools better when we do that. So one thing I want to key on, one lost year of control can be very costly. Cheatgrass can produce up to 15,000 plants and 18,000 seeds per square yard. So that goes back to what Derek was talking about earlier. It's not just getting it controlled once, it's getting it controlled long-term, because in one season, it can put itself back to a full infestation. So as we looked at this, we wanted to compare Rejuvra to other tools that we had. And one of the other tools is Plateau. And this isn't meant to beat up on Plateau. Plateau is a great herbicide and has been one of our gold standard tools for quite a while. But again, it only deals with the infestation that it has contact with, and maybe some residual activity, but not a residual activity that was lined up with the seed bank. So with Rejuvra, it gives us great opportunity with a one-time application, which reduces our workload and management. We can get it on. We're not every year having to scout, work with that aerial applicator, get maps to him. All the rest of that, we can just put it on once and check that box and put it behind. It's safety on existing desirable forbs and grasses, as we talked about earlier. That's very key because that raises the quality of forage that we're going to have, which reduces our expenses trying to support her operation. And when we get that much more grass, it's like getting more rangeland. And where can you get more rangeland for that cost of Rejuvra? So, but we started to break it down so we could make an equal comparison. So Rejuvra applied once with 4 years worth of efficacy comes to $13.19 per acre for that 4-year amount of efficacy. Whereas at plateau, we would have to use it every year to be equally as effective as Rejuvra. And by the time you take plateau and the application method, in this one we use a fixed wing aircraft and some adjuvant because you're going to be dealing with live plants. It actually turned out to be $14.20. It was actually more than Rejuvra. And that many years of Rejuvra or of a plateau in a row is going to have some pretty significant impacts, negative impacts on the forage resource. So this is my last slide, and there's a lot of words on it. I'm not going to get into all of them, but mainly what I want to point out that sustainability in the ag industry, and especially ranching right now, is very difficult, along with preserving equity. And so when you can renovate and elevate your core resource, your factory, the one asset you have that you paid the most for, and that your whole operation is tailored around, you now do start to preserve and build equity and prepare the ranch to be for the next generation and being a good steward to hand that off. So a quick summary of everything that we've talked about today, because you've kind of been drinking from the cheatgrass and cattle fire hoses. We're getting excellent control on annual grasses of multiple broadleaf species, significant reduction in fine needles and fire danger, restoration of native plant communities and ecosystem, because as livestock producers, we're partners in all these lands that we operate. We're not the only ones there. And when the ecosystem's elevated, we all benefit from that. Increased forage yield and quality, improved livestock efficiency and performance, and an excellent return on investment and increased ranch profitability. So this is kind of my last slide. Derek and I both want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this and consider what we have here. But one quick thing I want to talk about is we have what we call a trial use program coming, where we're going to offer you a discount on your first case of Rejuvra that you buy, and you can that rebate is going to be, you can use it to buy a companion herbicide, because as Derek mentioned, we're getting into the time of year where we're going to want to add another herbicide to take care of what may be sprouted. You could use that rebate to help offset the application costs. And it's just, we want that out there to just help you have a little greater peace of mind as you purchase this new tool and integrate it into your operation. So thank you again very much. And Sarah, I'll turn it over to you for any questions we may have.
Thank you guys so much. It's a lot to learn, but we will be resharing this so folks can come back to it and re-listen. So this is the time we'll open it up for any questions that any of our attendees may have. You can click raise hand if you want me to unmute you and you can ask it, or you can also use the chat box function. So I'll give folks a second to kind of work on those questions. And in the meantime, we had someone that messaged me and they said they might have missed it, but can you guys go over what the optimal time period is for application and then potentially the optimal application method?
Yeah, so the timing, it's kind of interesting because you can apply it almost year round. It's whether you need to add a tank mix partner to the tank to provide control of any cheatgrass that's already germinated. And that's the big thing, is you want to get Rejuvra by itself out 1 to 2 months before germination is going to occur. And usually that's in late August. So you want to go out with straight Rejuvra in June or July. And the tool is different than other tools because it doesn't photodegrade by sunlight very much at all. So it'll actually sit on the soil and wait for moisture for, we recommend, get rainfall within a month of applying. But, like some herbicides, if you don't get rainfall within a week, it's volatilized and it's gone. So this does stick around. In terms of post-emergent, so once we get cheatgrass starting to germinate, or if we're in that window, which is typically August through October. We like to add a tank mix partner that's going to control those cheatgrass seedlings that have already germinated, because Rejuvra is not going to control any of those plants that have roots already growing. And so what we like to do is tank mix with Plateau or Imazapic in that August to October timeframe. So you would be looking at Rejuvra 5 ounces plus Plateau 5 ounces. And that's going to give you that post-emergent and residual control by having both of those products in the tank mix. And the final option is if it's dormant season and your native perennial grasses are all dormant and brown, you can use the glyphosate as your post-emergent tank mix, because a low-rated glyphosate does really well on those cheatgrass seedlings post-emergent. So if you're in, that October through the winter and into March timeframe, you can do Rejuvra plus 8 to 10 ounces of glyphosate, and that's another option. So really, depending on the time of year, there's a lot of different options and flexibility. It's just what do you want to add to the tank, depending on what time of year it is.
Thanks, Derek. Any other folks? Looks like we have a question. Kelly was curious, will Rejuvra be available in quart-sized containers in the future? 2.5 gallons is cost prohibitive, as some local governments are facing significant budget shortfalls during 2020-2021.
So I'll handle that, Derek. So yes, Kelly, we will. And as we regret we don't have them now. We were trying to get the product quickly out to you as quickly as we could so we could capture another year of control, because in a lot of ways that's very key, especially with Bentonite and Medusa head. But we're in what we call the IRD process with Rejuvra right now to get the quartz, the artwork done, the bottling ready, and to get the quartz made. And they should be out in the next 4 to 5 months and available for sale.
Excellent. Any other questions from our attendees?
I guess there was the one question on application technique. So you can apply, via ground. Coverage is really critical, because you can imagine we're trying to lay this out like a blanket on the landscape, because we're trying to control hundreds of millions of little seedlings. So coverage is very key. We've done work by ground via fixed boom and boomless nozzles. You're not going to get as good a coverage boomless nozzles on the tail end, so you got to be a little bit careful there. But by ground, we recommend 15 to 20 GPA. And then we're doing a lot of work via aircraft as well. So fixed wing and helicopter, it's also labeled. And we just recommend at least 5 gallons per acre. And we want to have a small to medium sized droplet. So we want a lot of droplets uniform over that area. And that's given us the best level of control. And anything else, Justin, on that?
No, Derek, that's great. Another thing that's very key, this herbicide binds very tightly, is what Derek said, which is its strength. That's what makes it very successful, but it's not very mobile at all. And so also in application, you want to use swath guidance. You want to make sure that your swath accuracy from pass to pass and back to forth is very accurate, because as this product drops below the label rate, its efficacy drops as well. And we don't want to lose that. We don't want to create those seed resources between passes 2 to 3 years down the line as that herbicide wears off. So swath guidance, very accurate application is very, very key. And please reach out to me or Derek if you have any more questions. We have some resources we can share with you, or we'd be very happy to talk with your applicator and help him get an understanding of the product and how it binds in the site and the best management practices in getting it applied.
We've got one more question in the Q&A, and then we might wrap this up because we're getting close to that hour. We had a question from Charles. What would the mix per gallon be for spot treatment?
Yeah, the big thing on that is just calibrating your hand sprayer just to know your output. So if it's 20 gallons per acre output of your sprayer, that means if your target rate is 5 ounces per acre, you'll just divide 5 ounces by 20, and that would be how much you would add to 1 gallon of water. So it all depends on your calibration. So if it's 10 gallons per acre output or 20, it's gonna change that value. But feel free to reach out. Our phone number is there if you need specific help with that and calibration. But like we talked about though, coverage is key. So if you are doing hand boom, it's good to maybe add a dye so you know you're getting good coverage over that area. But yeah.
Great. Any more last minute questions for Justin or Derek? We can share their contact information when we redistribute this recording so folks can reach out to them directly, maybe with some more personalized questions. So I'll give you guys half a second for any other questions.
And Sarah, one thing too is
All right, Justin or
so one thing too is we get that trial or use program ready to distribute. Maybe we can circle back to you and provide that to you, and you can send that to those who have participated in this webinar and also your membership.
yeah, that would be great. More information about that as it comes available, and we can definitely get folks in the loop when you guys have that released. And I guess if there's just any other parting words from Derek or Justin, we really appreciate you guys taking the time to.
No, I don't think I have anything else. And likewise, we very much appreciate your time to work through this information with us.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys so much. Thanks for everyone who attended. Oh, everyone just said thanks. Okay, we're gonna end the web. Oh, wait, Bob Warner, did you have one more quick question maybe? I'm going to see if he'll unmute maybe. Oh, I don't see it. All right, well, we'll connect with Bob, and if he has another question, we can make sure to direct him to you guys. But thanks so much on behalf of CCA. We really appreciate the support, and have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.